So, where have I been? Just procrastinating for about 8 months. But let's just ignore that. Also, the clips will sound probably a bit odd because I've not recorded these in order, as most of the footage you will see is from about 3 months ago. Anyways, I have always wanted to partake in a game jam, but with Roblox you are very limited in that regard. I only realized this recently and decided to take a look for any non-Roblox related ones. And I did find one. My instant idea was probably as unfitting as over-ambitious. I wanted to make a 3-dimensional game where the player could run around the junkyard covered in items, pick up any of said items, and create diverse machines capable of different things using these items. Oh, how naive I was. But oh well, I didn't think so at the time. Day 1 didn't have much going for it. I thought a little of a title, designed a horribly crude character controller, and modeled a wrench. I decided that I would make the entire game in a cartoony style which would hopefully make it look great, and if I'm lucky not mean that any computer running it explodes. Due to the concept of the game being centered around being able to collect items and using those, I imagined that people might appreciate there being more objects than just one wrench, which, spoiler alert, will never actually be obtainable or functional. It was at this point that I started getting distracted, and despite me at the time not knowing over how overambitious my project was, I did know that I couldn't let that happen, so I put the game jam deadline on the 3rd monitor I temporarily had. After making a fence and laying out the general shape of the junkyard without getting distracted, I was starting to feel really emotionally drained. I didn't know what to do against it until I suddenly remembered my all-powerful magic weapon: music. Now, unironically, music is something that can manage to keep me doing boring or slightly unpleasant but necessary tasks for hours until completion. Now that I was able to focus, I went to use the Unity terrain system for the first time and made this somewhat decent shape for the junkyard, and used Material Maker to create a distrust-inducing material. Aside from me making a silly, but I was sure necessary graffiti, which due to the used program, I had to remove way too much background from, I finished off the day by making a guard robot and making a walking animation for it, which, might I say, actually looks rather decent. Picking up items. I guess that is something rather necessary for the game. So of course I need to make a system rather early to make sure it works in the end. So, if you add an object, you need to unpack 2 mesh prefabs for both meshes and the object prefabs add to collectible object. Make sure the object does not use a concave collision shape. Set the rigid body linear dampening to 2. Add the finished prefab to the list of spawnables. I'll get to that later. And add the object prefab to the list of pickables in the camera pickup ability script, and likely do a couple more things that I'm currently unable to recall. Okay. I hadn't thought I'd actually manage that. Now, as I stated, the junkyard will be covered in trash, which can be collected, but for this, we need to cover junkyard. Now, as all good game developers should before going to make a giant system, I wanted to test the concept in a small scale first, so I made a test with just as little as 100 objects spawning around the map without even having rigid bodies. For some reason, the frame rate was already rivaling a master in Tai Chi and winning by a devastating margin. Despite how it might be appearing, I actually do not have a problem with mindfulness, but if it makes my game look a slideshow running on Windows 11, that is where to cut the line. Let's just skip the monologue about thoughts and directly say, I just replaced this part of the game concept for instead a garbage truck arriving in intervals to deliver trash. And to fix the lag of potential pileups, all I had to do is have the garbage truck be delivering it into an incinerator plant. But what does an incinerator plant look like? Upon careful research, it seems that I can make just about anything as long as it has chimneys and other factory-like components. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we've got ourselves a nice-looking garbage incinerator. Aside from that, look in the sky and tell me you don't see what is obviously missing. Clouds, of course. So let's make some 4 different models and 1 C# script that was definitely written by me later. We have this neat system and can get to do something even more necessary: conveyors. Apart from being every factory builder enjoyer and madman's favorite invention, these bad boys are what will keep everyone's computer running this game from exploding after a short period of time. Now, can you tell me what is missing from this waste disposal plant? A. Particles to make it look nicer. B, having it actually destroy garbage, or C, animated chimneys? The answer is all of the above, although unfortunately I never got to the last. Time to make a garbage truck. Why? Because if you don't have the short-term memory span of a goldfish, you will remember that this is how we are going to be giving trash to the player. And finished. Now, script writing me is a bit lazy, and for all of our sake, let's just say thing where it arrives, waypoint system, sit 180 parking strat, and the truck is finished in all regards. Now, trees. Yeah, screw the original idea of a city. I'm already almost halfway through the jam and have too much stuff to do as that I can also make a whole city. Now, as my mental state has been slowly disintegrating during this jam, I was now not doing the logical thing of also placing the trees, but instead made the SCRIPTERBLOX because, in lack of better analogy, I will say that without it, this style looks objectively terrible. And despite it making no sense after adding the SCRIPTERBLOX, Unity decides to literally apply ambient occlusion in the corners. Please do not ask me why. A sad attempt at using the tree tool that went on into... and I have some kind of broken trees distributed. Now currently, the robot seems to be suffering from a well-known disease known as being static. First, he needs a run animation. Yes, this is going to be the run animation, where his legs pretend to be pistons. He is a robot. Do not question it. I prescribe him a once-off dose of a 95-line C# script and a configured animated component, and after some floundering, he walks like a charm. One workbench model later, the day was over and we continued to... and I'm pretty sure I know exactly how to make the crafting system. He did in fact not know how to make it. After spending an atrocious amount of time trying to figure out on how to draw a simple image onto the screen, I made a quarantine that moves the camera to be looking at the workbench, and spent half an hour implementing that the escape key returns the camera and re-enables the movement. And after adding the possibility to select a recipe, I completely sidetracked and for a very short period of time worked on the house. Which is really necessary as the house currently kinda looks like the bathrooms. And now I'm going to make some outside surroundings and actually manage to fix the issues with the trees disappearing. Why? Because I'm turning into a lunatic who can't focus on one task for any notable period of time. You know what is not terrific but actually terrifying? My frame rate. I wanted known that I have good hardware. What do I mean by good? To be precise, a 12th generation Intel processor in 4060. So considering this game is not attempting to feature some photorealistic graphics, I think I should be worried at only getting 20 to 40 frames per second. Now how are we going to fix this? Good question. I didn't really have an answer and was only stabbing into the dark with my attempts. I started off by fixing some bugs where the trash burner would only spit out an error instead of burning trash, which already stabilized the frame rate. It was still atrocious, but at least stable for now. Next step, my all over the place mind was to remove the slight bevels on the objects to remove vertices from them. Trust me, it was absolute pain. And as a reward for my painstaking individual removal of polygons to increase the frame rate, I got nothing. Yep, that did not make the frame rate change at all. Now, I know what most of you are probably streaming right now, and honestly, I can't remember if at the time I was either idiotic or had thoughts of it but spared it for now. I'm obviously talking about the 753 trees, each containing multiple thousand vertices. Talking about thousands of vertices, this was the moment I opened the statistics screen and well, I think almost 8 million triangles might be a problem. Now how do we fix this, you are asking? I'm glad you asked. At the time, I had no idea, and whilst experimenting, made only few notes, so prepare for a very bad recalling from memory. Unity has a system dedicated to this precise problem, and luckily I had already done the groundwork for using it. You see, I hadn't just placed the trees around, but instead used the inbuilt Unity tree tool to scatter them around with a brush. Setting this up was already rather unstraightforward. The specific details I do not remember, but to use the fates for this terrible optimization problem, even more unobvious steps will need to be taken. In the Unity tree system, it is inbuilt that if the trees are correctly configured, then at a certain distance on a very crude billboard, all of them will be rendered for a massive performance boost. What configuration to be precise? I have no idea. If I recall correctly, it was something along the lines of applying certain shaders to the tree prefabs, and in the process summoning the devil of 3D modeling and polygon shading in the process. Although this problem was mostly fixed after randomly changing around the shading properties until it looked kind of normal. And aside from the shading issues, a few minor details arose. Although I was able to fix that by removing and re-adding all of the trees. My final idea on how to improve optimization was to replace the C# script iterating through approximately 500 clouds every frame to instead use a compute shader, which would do so on the GPU in parallel. However, as I have never before attempted to use compute shaders, I was entirely clueless as to how I would do such sorcery. It wasn't much to worry about, however, as my implemented optimization already got me back at around 60 to 70 frames per second again, and the triangle count had been divided by 3. Very nice. And my munchy brain goes back to the house interior. Only very shortly though, as I switch back to making items that can be found on the junkyard. And what do I start day 7 with? Obviously with
working on the crafting system.
And then disaster struck. You see, up until now I was heavily relying on the GitHub Copilot extension in Visual Studio Code.
Yes, a lot of this game was vibe coded, I will talk about it later.
And had it fix all errors for me. However, now, in the middle of having like 7 errors, said Copilot extension seems to have gone for a coffee break and never returned. So now I'm in this situation of effectively having to understand code I haven't really written myself, containing countless bugs and having to fix them all, and somehow I managed to pull off the impossible. I managed to code completely on my own, which was actually around the first time in probably 2 years. Pause. What do I mean by in around 2 years? Well, by my best memory, that is when Roblox introduced their own version of the GitHub Copilot extension for IDEs. So I've been using that and alternatives since then, and I actually made some progress on the crafting system. Now by this point I had forced myself to be working on this game from 10 to 8 for the past 7 days. And I'm not sure, but I think that is quite a while. So I think it is quite logical that at this point I was beginning to go slightly insane. This was only lingered by the fact that for almost the entire mentioned time I was listening to some music, which without it I would have likely considered C-made for our Lord and Savior. And my slow descent into insanity was furthered by the fact I had now been searching for the cause of an odd behavior for around half an hour, and it turned out that it was that a certain part of my code gives an object that had crafted object, but the code checking for such objects was checking for objects with the tag crafter object. I imagine you can understand my irritation. But all of that was worth it, because now the crafting system worked completely, with definitely no issues whatsoever. So, what do you make after having created a rusty little workbench? Of course, a high-tech computer running Windows. Whilst you're not looking at the computer, it has this TV static. Why? Because it's... What's the step after making the outside of a virtual computer? The operating system. And as now this computer is canonically running Windows, I do not care in the slightest that the computer menu is garbage. As a small detail, I made so all of the virtual websites have a URL displayed at the top, and made one for every website in the game. Now, as this was my first time making UI in Unity, and as the system made little to no sense to me, I was only getting very slow progress. Wow. No transition. Okay, after way too many side tangents and only marginally useful game aspects, let's discuss business. Up until now in this game, you're just some doofy doober who can craft random items and be chased by a guard robot. But that is not a game. This is a mostly complete gameplay loop. But who would dedicate hours of a life to a game that is neither complete nor designed for compelling gameplay? So, we need a way to win. There is a big backstory that will be skipped as it seems odd and isn't really necessary as to how I came up with the following idea. To stop the robots, people on the internet have devised a complex plan on 3 different devices which, when combined, will generate a special EMP that only affects the robots. These 3 devices are a anti-robot framework, it's the ATH computer case equivalent for this machine. Then you need a source code analyzer, which will somehow with programming and physics, math aid in the process of making the EMP only affect the robots. Now you will be asking, how can it analyze the source code if you have not stolen it or anything? Now, don't get wrong ideas and start thinking that I I had once intended to have, so the players must defeat a robot and steal this hard drive. No. That is propaganda that I do not tolerate. Instead, what is really true is that the evil mastermind to unleash these robots onto the world has taken an open source AI code and only slightly modified it, and coincidentally the player knows where to find the original piece of code. And the final piece needed is a special EMP launcher. I imagine I shouldn't need to explain that. And aside from starting work on a winning cutscene made in Blender, and me not knowing how to somehow get that into Unity, you really didn't expect that, did you? Only 26 lines since last time. But aside from adding a big button to the computer to sell items in a certain area, the last day was mostly about
sound design time.
You knew I had to do that joke. But seriously, until now this game is partially more terrifying due to the lack of any sound. So I first spent around half an hour to get Arturia Software Center to run on Ubuntu, only for me to proceed only using onlinesequencer.net to make a junkyard theme and one for the house. For the general outside, I just downloaded a video of birds chirping and turned it into an MP3 file. Now, after a bit of contemplating, I made a list of sounds I would need. I decided that I would make most of the sounds myself, and the other ones I would just find some sound button and use that. I actually had on the list of sounds a sound for when an object falls onto the floor, but I removed it later as I realized it would likely be too time consuming to attempt to find a way to implement that. Although, before I had decided that, I was looking for one on some sound button website, and I stumbled upon the falling pipe sound effect. Now, I do not know if it was due to the numerously mentioned endorphin withdrawal, or that this was actually funny, but the thought that every time something fell on the floor, only in the slightest, made me laugh so hard I got something like an asthma attack. But aside from that, the sound effects are now finished and implemented. This, however, had the confusing side effect that the frame rate was now halved again. Lovely. Just lovely. Like seriously, what have I done now? Okay. It might be that I'm using MP3 files, which might have some performance issues due to decompression. Let's just convert all of them to .wav and hope that helps. Nope, the frame rate did not even budge. I started the day by actually compiling the project, and I did not have a clue about the precise stats, but was able to tell that I was getting a good frame rate. With this problem taken care of, I proceeded to make holograms for what you are crafting, and making the chart louder, and making an external website for the crafting recipes. Why did I make an external website for this purpose? Because I actually know how to, and the thought of doing UI in Unity brings me suicidal thoughts. You know what doesn't give me those, though? A website with no less than 290 lines of HTML and 93 lines of CSS. Although I couldn't quite entirely ignore the UI as I had to make a button that links to the website. Terrifying, I know. And after some odd jobs and making a thumbnail, I uploaded the game to the Game Jam that day, thinking I had finally brought the pain behind me. Now, I hadn't expected it, but due to time zone stuff, I actually still had around 2 hours before the submission deadline. I'd originally intended just to ignore that and not be caring that much about the Game Jam anymore, but when I proceeded to test the game a bit, just for fun, I found a very big issue. Now, the initial issue of items not being able to be added was, when I remember correctly, just some tags mismatching, although upon fixing it, the issue was followed with the player being deleted, followed by a very confusing and not any less impractical bug. You see, I don't know about you, but I personally would prefer, when adding an item to the crafting recipe, not being teleported in front of the house, being unable to move, and being rapidly fading in and out of consciousness. In case you're wondering why I'm so vague about the original issue, the problem is that these are the entirety of my notes for day 11. Now, I spent the next at least half an hour scurrying through the
code and going mentally insane over the stubborn AI co-pilot not doing the one thing it is supposed to be useful for, yet couldn't find the root of the issue. But then, upon experimenting in the scene view in the Unity editor, I moved the character slightly up and then he was free. So now I had an idea. If I couldn't fix the cause of the issue, I could most definitely fix the symptoms. I inserted a line of code at the end of the craft function that just slightly moves the character up, and what do I know? The character stops behaving like an average Windows enjoyer. If I was to apply Microsoft with this solution, I'd practically be made lead programmer on the spot. Justified jokes about Microsoft aside, I, after spending a large amount of time trying to figure out how to get Unity to make a Windows export of the game that actually worked, managed to hand in the fixed version of the game just in time. If only my crippling condition forcing me to rename things to Pastel case wouldn't have only not affected the exe file for the Windows version. Oh well, it's only that half the people who wanted to test my game didn't have an intellectual capacity higher than the average iPad kid.
Okay, finally. After over a year, I have now come up with this. I know that this is not a monument of quality, however I much prefer finally releasing anything than to continue trying to improve this. Now, I mentioned I would get back to the part about this game being vibe coded. Now, I'm not an AI hater, or anything as such, however, even during the jam, I realized that continuing to work on this project would be painful, in part as I had effectively not written it myself, in other part due to AI generated code being bound to lower quality and less usability. This is also one of the reasons why I will not be continuing this project, as I would need to start by recreating the entire code base, which is something I unfortunately cannot motivate myself to do currently. Additionally, I cannot say that uploads will become more frequent, as currently I do not enjoy video editing at all. I've been thinking of ways to tackle this issue, and my only ideas so far have been to replace my character with something less monotonous to create and to find a tool that reduces the amount of grunt work in editing, namely cutting breathing segments from my voiceovers. But after this long of a time, all I can say is thank you for watching.